It is my opinion, without any reasonable doubt and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency.
Hey, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Emilio, and this is the Comic Chronicles, the show where we talk about comics all in a hazy state of mind. Given that this is our first episode, and also a holiday that I'm not legally allowed to talk about, I thought I'd start by making our first episode about this collection of comics published by Dark Horse, known as Reefer Madness. This collection has like 22 comics in there, and it has this intro that's a few pages long, but it's definitely an interesting read. It talks about how comics were seen as evil back in the mid-20th century, and then it also talks about how around the same time period was when they started making marijuana legal. So one of the things that the introduction talks about is how marijuana and comics were seen as evil. But combining the two to create comics about marijuana, it started getting what's seen as nowadays is it's pretty funny nowadays, considering all the legalization we've been doing to marijuana, with states using it recreationally like Colorado and many states that are using it as medicinally. The way that it's seen nowadays is almost laughable, and it's almost ironic, you know? So out of all of the 22 comics that were published, that were put together in this collection, there are 5 that stood out to me. And some of the reasons that they stood out to me was because, one, the story was either too crazy that marijuana was almost unessential to that story, and there were some that specifically used really racist remarks towards a certain race, and they used that as a reason to basically instill a fear of marijuana and minorities. And the other 2 that I picked were mostly because it wasn't necessarily like the comic itself so much as like who created them. These 2 were written by some of the biggest names in comics, like right up there with Stan Lee and all of the other comic writing greats. Alright, so this first one I'm going to talk about is this comic called Carrie Drake. And basically it was this super long, like 27-page comic. And it starts with this girl who's going to a party, and she's going with her older sister. Her older sister smoked marijuana, but she's never done it, so she's hesitant to try it. And then she ends up meeting up with this guy who does smoke, and eventually they start smoking together, and they start driving together. And from here, this kid dies, the guy dies, and then basically for a few pages like after that, I completely forget that this whole comic's about marijuana, because it made it seem like such an unnecessary fear that after that boy died, the whole story was focused on this detective that was actually trying to stop or catch the criminals that sold the kid marijuana. And then it goes from being this harmless teenage party story to this whole detective crime story on like the last pages. And one of the reasons that I thought that one stood out is because basically they were using marijuana to create it as a plot device, but they didn't use any like hard-hitting facts about why marijuana was dangerous or why people are smoking this. And basically it created an unnecessary fear just by being like within maybe a few pages of that entire comic. Alright, and then this other one that really caught my attention was this one from Danger Number 4. And basically, this whole comic revolved around these two law enforcers that were working on the border. And one of the things that this comic does very expectedly in the mid-20th century is it makes a whole bunch of racist remarks. So the law enforcers are literally referring to the criminals who happen to be of Hispanic culture. They start referring to them as wetbacks. And then if that isn't bad enough, some of the criminals that they're hunting down, they start speaking in broken English. So they start saying things like, "No, sir, no, senor, please, no tell name, no." Basically just saying that they won't rat out their boss from those very minimal words that they've learned in English. Bad as that might be, I still think I'm still relieved that that's the only issue in this comic to actually have some sort of like racial remark like that. But anyways, I digress. Alright, and then these two other comics that I found the most interesting was mostly because, not because of the story that was told in these comics, but the fact that they were made by some of the biggest names in comics. So, for example, there was this one called Federal Men from Action Comics number 39, which was written by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. And one of the reasons that I enjoyed that one the most was because it was made by the two men who actually created Superman, the biggest superhero in comics. And then like there was this other one that was drawn by Jack Kirby. This one was from Headline Comics number 24, and it was drawn by Jack Kirby, who is one of the name amongst names. He's famous for creating a whole bunch of characters from the Marvel Universe, like the X-Men, Fantastic Four, Captain America. And one of the things that I enjoyed so much about those two comics, like I said, isn't necessarily because the whole story, but because it showed these two gigantic names in comics making comics that basically just showed the evil effects of marijuana, quote unquote. And like from there, it's kind of a reminder to me like how some people would do a job like that revolved around comics, but they wouldn't necessarily be happy about it. Sort of like how George Clooney was Batman, or how Ben Affleck was Batman, or just any of these entire Batman reboots. The last issue that I found interesting is also from the last actual comic in this collection, because it tells the story of this guy who's basically, he's got a bright future ahead of him. He's in high school. He's working at a part-time job, making his own money, and he starts getting involved with this group of kids that are basically influencing him to try marijuana. And from there, one of the things, like, as his life begins to spiral out of control, it's this typical story of, like, showing how drugs can affect you and basically destroy your good-looking future and basically reduce you down to poverty. And one of the things that I enjoyed the most about that comic is from the very last panel, because it said how junkies, the people who are addicted to drugs, they're basically like the living dead, and the narrator agrees that that's the case, because from there, like, they're completely dependent on drugs and they basically have no mind of their own. And one of the things that I enjoyed about that was how it perfectly concluded the whole entire collection, just stating how marijuana was evil and how it would basically reduce your life to sending you to prison or living in complete poverty. Alright, so in conclusion, to sum it all up, all these comics published by Dark Horse, they all instilled this exaggerated fear that was marijuana. And especially since these were all written in the mid-20th century, and given the circumstances nowadays where marijuana is now being legalized throughout the whole country, it's seen more as a joke, where there's slang in this whole collection, saying terms like Satan's cigarettes, the devil's lettuce, basically just creating reefers. They're basically just, they're used nowadays more as a joke to basically make fun of how people in the mid-20th century were creating this whole irrational fear of marijuana. And so nowadays, there's this whole cult vintage classicness to it, where people are reading this stuff and then from there, like, they're being exposed to a certain part of history. Alright, so in conclusion, Reefer Madness, if it's something that you're interested in, definitely feel free to check out your local comic shop, see if you can call and get it pre-ordered. Chances are Reefer Madness could be available in your comic shop, or yours, or yours, or yours. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Emilio. Join us next time as we take another hit from our stash. This is the Comic Chronicles.